Madam President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of people have been greeted this evening, but I want to do one special greeting. And I want to tell you that I would like to greet your daughters, because I think I remember very well when I had your age, and my father would take me along to different events. And he was at that time really, instilling in me this interest for politics and what values really mean and how I can help my parents achieve that, to be able to do it later myself. And that's why I think it's really, really great, and I thank you very much that you brought your family and your husband, that you are all coming to this special event when we're talking about values, because of course all that we're dealing with here, also in this heritage of Coudenhove-Kalergi and of all the very eminent persons that were receiving that prize before, it is about values. And when we're talking about the people that were receiving the prize before, I mean, of course, there is one person I have to mention, which is one of your predecessors, who was getting the prize 20 years before you. It was Ibrahim Rugova. And again, in this connection, I want to mention that for me it was the same. Of course, my father was also taking me along to these events. And it was a special relationship that he had with President Rugova. It was, I would say, a relationship that was going far beyond a professional relationship. There was really a personal friendship there, all the way to the extent that when my father was wearing a shawl, he was always kind of relating to President Rugova, who historically, as we know, was always wearing a shawl. He was getting, at the time, the Coudenhove-Kalergi Prize for his clear pan-European engagement for an independent Kosovo. And before that, of course, I think one has to mention that out of the political situation he was growing from, he was also, and my father was very much engaged in that, the European Parliament, the Sakharov Prize. I always like to mention that it's the Sakharov Prize for the freedom of thought. And that was at the time not something which was automatically and understandable, but I think it was incredibly important that he at that stage was first awarded the Sakharov Prize, later the Coudenhove-Kalergi Prize, to kind of show this historic dimension. This was in 2004, and we should not forget that 1 year before that happened was the Thessaloniki summit, which was talking about Southeast Europe, how Southeast Europe would get a perspective of the European Union, and the importance for this region of Europe, that this region of Europe would actually have for the stability and security in Europe that would develop here. The necessity for stability and security has not changed. We are in the middle of a new structuring of Europe, and we have seen this within the last 110 years several times, that a complete new structuring of Europe was taking place. We have seen it in 1918 after the First World War, in 1945 after the Second World War. We have seen it again in 1989, and this was a little bit of a botched restructuring, I would say. We were all very happy when the Iron Curtain was falling and a good part of Europe was gaining its freedom. But what happened in the West was that the West basically was cashing into their into a perceived security, and they were not investing into the necessary, the peace dividend was cashed in, and it was not enough invested into the security of the continent, which basically was leading us to an existential question to all of Europeans, and that is, do we want to play a role in the world in the future, or are we just passengers on the train of history? And I think the Balkan region was understanding much more the development what was happening and the dangers that were engaged in this. They were going through several wars and conflict in order to understand this, whereas the rest of Europe did rely on the US and did not really understand the problem of that concept. Geopolitically, Europe was not really existing anymore. Putin's strategy of energy as a weapon and corrupting politicians was not understood in the West. And the so-called New World Order has changed since '89 several times, from a bipolarity of the Cold War between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, to the monopolarity when the US was calling the shots, let's put it this way, no pun intended, for some time alone and deciding what was happening, to a multipolarity where regional forces were developing over the last couple of years, to a situation as we have it today, since a couple of months or a couple of weeks. And I'm a little bit bereft of words to say how to describe foreign politics currently. Because if I'm looking at what is happening in the United States, it always gives me the vision of foreign politics not being constructed with little Lego blocks in a multicolored, multifaceted way as foreign politics really needs. But foreign politics suddenly is built out of these huge roadblocks that are put into the way of other countries and that really do not allow free functioning of international politics, and it is much more shooting from the hip than the construction of foreign politics. On the other side, of course, Moscow wants to position itself as a world power, and they started doing this when they saw that America was withdrawing from Syria, and they could go into Syria and taking a much more stronger role in world politics. And at the same time, China wanted to be the world power #1, whereas they had a great problem and still have a great problem with that, and that's the Chinese demography, where they will get old before they get rich. And therefore also China has to work hard on what they are doing. Regional powers also want to play a bigger role, whether it is the BRICS countries or Turkey or Iran. But especially China and Russia have a different concept of the fundamental principles of society. There is this interesting word of the dragon bear that gets used to describe where do the Chinese and the Russian interests actually overlap. China has shown through its attack on Ukraine that it is leading a war against Western values, against freedom, democracy, rule of law, as it has been mentioned here before, human rights, market economy. It is not a war between countries, but it is a war between ideologies. Ukraine, with the successes it had, Ukraine was not only a success story, we know that, it had great difficulties, but with the success that it had with Western values, it became a threat to Russia because it was a good example. Some politicians then thought it is enough to say we are supporting Ukraine as long as it takes. And I have to tell you that this expression, as long as it takes, is really getting very much on my nerves, because it just covers up the cowardice of not wanting to define what it really means, what it means, as long as it takes, what is actually the goal that should be described, that this conflict should bring in our interest, not necessarily particularly in the interest of non-Europeans, but we are Europeans, we have to see what our interest is. And that is definitely the integrity and sovereignty of the Ukraine in the borders of 1994. It is, of course, reparations, but I think since I am not in an active political position, I can use this expression. Of course, we should also say we are interested in a regime change in Russia as a result of this conflict, because we want to deal with Russia as a successful and rich neighbor, but not as a criminal state that is misusing the state as a gas station that they have kidnapped, and they are blackmailing the entire world with the prices as a succession of that. We are in Europe back in a situation like we were once before in 1938, 1939, when the barbarians were knocking at our doors. And today's Chamberlains and Daladiers are talking about peace in our time, but this is actually, of course, not possible with Russia. China also wants to reinterpret values, because this is where the interest of change of values overlaps between Russia and China in the way that they are redefining what are human rights, by changing the collective, the human rights, which is applying to individual persons, to the collective rights, and not necessarily applying to the individual, but also where they are redefining what is the question of private property. And of course, when we look what's happening with patents or what's happening with reverse engineering, private property is not playing such a big role anymore. But history tells us if we want to keep our values, the values that we have recognized as good and important values for our future, we have to defend them and we have to fight for them. Democracy and human rights can not be taken for granted. And one has to say here that sometimes, which I would call a stabilocracy, is not replacing that. Stabilocracy does not mean stability, and I'm sure you understand what I mean with stabilocracy when we're looking at some of our, sometimes here in Vienna, very close neighbors that are taking into consideration and taking the risk of damage to the rule of law and damage to democracy in order to give a perceived stability of a country where it's not. We have to fight for democracy. We have to fight for the rule of law. It is also very dangerous when we see that in some places a vacuum is happening in politics. This is not acceptable. And if Europe is not active, then other countries are actually mixing into these vacuums. We have seen the destructive role of Russia in the Balkans, which I put to some degree definitely as a fault of Europe, of not offering enough solution and supports to actually integrate the Balkans better into this case. Enlargement needs a new dynamic. I know we're talking about families. My father was always talking about Europe, the enlargement, saying the further we can expand the border of freedom, the more security the entire construction is becoming. So enlargement, I think, is a fundamental need for the European Union. We have many countries that are in line to do that. We have the discussion about Ukraine going on. And I think it's always important to point out how much the integration into the European Union also means stability and security. We heard from so many countries when they were discussing should we opt rather for NATO or rather for the European Union. I mean, I'm a passionate European, and as such, I always like to point out that on one side, of course, there's Article 42, paragraph 7 of the EU Treaty, which is talking about the mutual security support, which is actually a stronger wording than in NATO. But then, of course, there's also the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union, Article 222, which is dealing with solidarity, with necessary solidarity between the countries of the European Union when it comes to questions like terrorism. So there is a great security, not only the military security of NATO, but there is a great security within the European Union. And that is definitely also a role for Kosovo, and a role that you are playing and emphasizing a lot, of which we are very happy and very proud. Kosovo is clearly a Western-oriented country. And I think to some of our very Western members, we should emphasize this all the more to have a better understanding about the history of Kosovo, and that it cannot necessarily compared with certain other regions of Europe that should not necessarily be named at that stage. One of the points where Kosovo has shown its incredible European spirit is, of course, also when it came to the sanctions against Russia, which Kosovo has carried under your guidance and under your leadership in a strong way, and we Europeans should be very grateful for that. At the conference, 100 Years Pan-Europa, in November 2022, you, President Osmani, were declaring from this pulpit that I'm standing on here right now, that the Republic of Kosovo will file the application for membership in the European Union, which then actually was happening within days or a couple of weeks. It was happening the following month. It was happening in December 2022. We all are very proud that you are receiving the Coudenhove-Kalergi Prize today here with us. And we hope that this European prize is not only considered a recognition for the politics of Kosovo under President Osmani, but it is also a motivation for the European Union to declare the candidacy status to be able to start the membership negotiations. And this is what we all have to work on. So, congratulations from all pan-Europeans to you on that occasion. Thank you.